Good evening, ladies as well as gentlemen. I'm Papa Boris, and I'm going to do another game. This one is played between Wilhelm Steinitz, I'm probably not saying that correctly at all, and Kurt von Bardeleben in 1895. And Wilhelm Steinitz, as I'm sure you know, was the first world chess champion. Now, back when I was a kid and I was leafing through my beloved book, Journey to the Chess Kingdom, one of the sections in the book was a section on all the world champions. At the time, the book was published in 1972, and that, I believe, is the edition that I had when I was a kid, because the last world chess champion, according to the book, when I had a kid, was Boris Spassky. And that's realistic because he did not lose the title until 1972 to Bobby Fischer. When you buy the American version, they actually have an expanded section, so the chapter on World Chess Champions includes everybody up to, whoever the current World Chess Champion is. I didn't actually look through it. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have done some more preparation for this video. Anyhoodle, I'm going to go through some of the games of the World Chess Champions because I definitely remember some of these looking through the book as a kid, and this one really caught my eye. It has a very famous rook, as we shall see. Anyhoodle, that's enough introduction and blabbing. Let's get to the game. So Steinitz plays e4, and after some typical developing moves, we have the gioco piano, or the quiet game, or the Italian game with bishop c4. Then Kurt von Bardeleben plays bishop c5, and in a lot of these old games in the 1800s, you'll see the Evans Gambit. Some very exciting games featured this gambit to b4. Steinitz was not one of those, super artistic players. He was definitely the pioneer of science in chess. He just goes for the quiet c3 to develop the center with d4. After knight to f6, Steinitz goes ahead and plays d4, and after e takes d4 and c takes d4, the engines call this an equal position. So technically, Steinitz did not really do a good job playing the opening, and his opponent has succeeded as black in equalizing. One of the problems is that after bishop to b4 check, which von Bardeleben plays, and knight to c3, this pawn can actually be taken. Black can just straight up win this. Black can play, knight takes e4, and really, what do you do as white? If you castle, then black can take on c3, and after b takes c3, the pawn is immune to capture. If the knight takes the pawn, then queen to e1 check, forks the king and the knight, and then white's winning. But, you don't do that as black. You just play d5, attacking this bishop, and life's pretty good. This knight is on a file with the king, but white can't exploit this in time, and black just has a solid position up a pawn. So definitely the right move here was to take on e4, but the opponent black here played d5 straight away, which actually gives the advantage right back to white. So this is already like a roller coaster of mistakes here. The engines call white a pawn up in this position, which white pretty much is, because after e takes d5, you can take on d5 back, but now the problem is that there is a lot of pressure on this knight. And yes, there's pressure on the white knight on c3, but white can just castle out of it, and now black can't just simply resolve this tension. So if black were to try to say, okay, my knight's kind of in dire shape here, let me just capture on c3, after the pawn takes the knight back, you can't actually take on c3 with the bishop, because then you're running into queen to b3 attacking the bishop. And you have to give this bishop up as black in this situation. If you try to protect it, say you, gobble this pawn on d4, here comes bishop to f7 check, king d7 runs into mate in 1 on e6. If you try to go to f8, for example, then bishop to a3 comes, and yeah, you're in really, really bad shape after, say, knight to e7. You can just do whatever you want here as white, pretty much. You can go to, you can go to rook e1, attack on e7, and there's just no getting away from this. So, with this situation, these two knights attacking each other, they both look very weak, but the white knight kind of can't be taken. And so black is forced to protect his knight on d5 with bishop to e6. And at this point, Steinitz plays bishop to g5. This is not the most incisive way of taking advantage of the situation. The best play here would have been to play queen to b3 and continue piling on this knight. But bishop g5 is not terrible. White still has the edge here, attacks the queen. And Steinitz moves back with bishop to e7. For a very subtle reason, this is not the best move. Although, at the moment, it looks like it's a fine move. it's not clear until several moves later why this is weak. Better would have been just to move the queen and play queen to d7. This would have given black a better fighting chance. So what exactly, you might say, is the problem with bishop to e7? Well, white now forcefully initiates a series of exchanges. He captures on d5, and again, after the queen captures back, white takes the bishop on e7. Now, you don't really want to take the bishop with your king and, forego castling for the whole game. Plus, you're on this open e file. You'd allow white to develop the rook on the open file with a tempo in check, so you move the knight there. But now, white plays rook to e1 anyways, and so Steinitz is a great position here. The material is equal, but he has a centered pawn. He has developed his rook on an open file, whereas von Bardeleben's rooks are completely undeveloped, and in order to connect his rooks, Mr. von Bardeleben would have to castle, but he can't castle because, of course, this knight is loose. So that's why white ends up with a slight advantage here as a result of this move, bishop back to e7, that von Bardeleben played to protect his queen from attack by white's dark-squared bishop. So here, von Bardeleben tries f6, which, according to the engine, is the best move in the position. And here, white plays queen to e2, simply threatening checkmate on e7. After black defends with queen to d7, the most accurate move in this position is rook a to d1. Now, the reason for this is, after rook a to d1, although it may seem like a perfectly innocuous move, right, black can get out of this annoying pin with king to f7, for example, and finally connect his rooks so they can get into the game. But this runs into queen to c4 check. Now, what do you do as black? If you block on d5, then white has this tactic, knight to e5 check, forking the black king and queen. So the knight must be captured, and after you capture the pawn back, this knight is pinned to the king by white's queen, and it's also attacked by the rook on d1. This is why you want to put the rook on d1. And now there's no way to prevent losing the piece back. If you try to protect it with c6, of course, congratulations, your king and your queen just got forked. So black has to give the knight back, because this is a very serious threat. He has to move like queen to c6 or something. And now white is actually up a pawn and has a superior position because his rooks are just blasting down these files. The rooks on the white end of things got a head start on the black rooks. So instead of blocking on c5, on d5, black could here, let me actually move back one move. If white had played rook to d1 and king to f7, black could, after this check, give up and go back to f8, but then white pushes d5. And this is not just to push the pawn, but it's to free the d4 square for the knight, and then this knight is coming into e6, where it will be an absolute monster. And notice that in this variation, again, it's quite convenient to have the rook on d1, protecting this pawn from capture by the black knight. So this is why rook a to d1 was slightly the more precise move here. Rook a to c1 allows black to play king to f7, and here if you try queen to c4, then after knight to d5, black is totally fine. This position is dead equal. Now knight to e5 is no longer a tactic because this rook is not on d1 to attack the knight. And on top of that, what the rook does do on c1 is attack the c7 pawn, but conveniently the knight on d5 protects it. So rook a to c1, not the most precise move. However, to Steinitz's great fortune, and frankly to the great fortune of all chess lovers everywhere, von Bardeleben did not play king to f7, which would have probably resulted in an unremarkable draw, and it would have just been one of thousands of boring drawn chess games lost to the sands of history. Instead, he played c6 for basically no reason. This move does jack nothing, and it's like white gets an extra move, and white takes advantage of the extra move that he's been given by pushing to d5. It's likely that von Bardeleben simply didn't realize the significance of this pawn push. It's not just for opening the file, but it's freeing the d4 square for the white knight to come to d4 and then come to e6 and become a monster, like I mentioned in the other variation. It's this possibility, this maneuver in the development of this knight on e6 is most likely what von Bardeleben missed. Now, black's best defense here still would have been to just go to f7 and get out of this terrible pin and battery of the white rook and queen. However, Bardeleben decided to grab the pawn, and now after knight to d4, there's absolutely no way for black to stop the knight coming to e6. At this point, von Bardeleben moved to f7 with his king, but it's too late because the knight comes in on e6, and this is a monster knight, It is just crimping black's style from here to evermore. And the best defense for black would probably be to play queen to d6. It's not great. You know, the rook is coming into the 7th rank, which is where rooks love to be. It's pinning the knight to the king. I mean, this is really not a great position for black, no matter what black decides to do. But black's defense of rook h to c8 was definitely not ideal, because this allows queen to g4. And that is bad news bears for black. If black ignores this queen and, say, exchanges rooks on c1, then black's getting mated in 2 moves, because queen to g7 check is pretty bad. The knight is protected by the rook on e1. After the king moves, the queen goes to f8, and that's checkmate. So this threat of queen takes g7 has to be parried. Von Bardeleben plays g6, which is the best move to hold in this position, but this allows the other thing the queen to g4 was threatening, which is knight to g5 check. Obviously, the knight cannot be taken because then your queen's hanging, and that's very, very bad for black. The only way for black to hang on to the queen is to move the king to the square that protects the queen, which is king to e8. And obviously, this is extremely precarious because, you know, this knight is pinned by the rook, and this queen is hanging on by a thread. Really, black's position here is being held together by some Play-Doh and clothespins. And it was at this moment that Steinitz found an absolutely incredible move. He went rook takes e7 check. I mean, how many of us would even consider this move in a game? There's 2 different ways that the rook can be recaptured, and one of them, it's not at all obvious what exactly white gets out of it for the exchange sacrifice, especially considering that black is threatening mate on the back row with rook takes c1. So all of white's moves have to be forcing checks. Nothing slow will do, and yet this holds. Now, it's really easy after watching this game to, you know, take a big fat steaming dump all over Kurt von Bardeleben for getting himself into this mess and dying horribly. But to his credit, he played king to f8. He realized that this rook could not be captured, and that definitely takes some calculation. So let's go through the variations. If you take the rook with the queen, then after rook takes c8, rook, there's no moves here. You can't obviously like put your queen and give it up. In fact, this is actually a mate in 2 with queen to e6, followed by queen to f7. So you can't block with the queen, even if you wanted to give your queen up. And after rook takes c8 and queen takes c8 check, the black king tragically has no moves. And so after queen to d8, the queens exchange, and whoops-a-dingle-daisy, you're in a king and pawn endgame, only white has a knight. To be sure, black does have a passed pawn in exchange for the knight, but I mean, I hope it's pretty clear to everybody that, yeah, white's definitely going to win this game. It's going to take a lot of moves to do it, but this is absolutely a 1 game. What else can you do? Well, if you take the rook with the king, that's where things get more subtle, and this is where I give von Bardeleben some credit for realizing that this cannot be done. What happens now is von Bardeleben, as black, must have calculated that queen b4 in quite a few variations ends up being very dire for black no matter what black does. So let's start by blocking. If you try to block the queen and force an exchange, what white can do here is play queen takes b7 check, and then there's just nothing good for black here. If you go to d8, then, well, it's actually a mate, you know, a forced mate in 4, but after the knight goes to f7 check, you know, white can't pick up the queen because there is this back rank situation, but the king only has 1 move, king to e8. This allows white to take the queen with check. On king to f8, we have queen f7 checkmate, and on king to d8, we have knight takes c8, and no matter what black does next, checkmate follows on the next move. What's being threatened is queen to e7 checkmate, and if you take the knight, then of course rook takes c8, but this is all a moot point because black's down a queen. So if black tries something else after queen takes b7, again, it's losing in all cases. If the king tries to move to e8, then we have a forced mate coming up after rook to e1 check. And if black tries to block once again, then rook to e1 check is a very powerful move. This gets the rook out of the line of fire of the black rook, preventing black's back row shenanigans. And if the king tries to run, say, to f8, well, then white picks up a queen. If the king tries to run to d8, then we have a forced mate in 5, beginning with knight f7 check, which, you know, the king has no moves, so it also is just straight up losing the queen. And finally, if the king goes to d6, then we have knight f7 check. The king actually has no moves in this case, and so black is forced to give up the queen. So after the queen block, in response to queen b4 check, black loses. If black tries to move the king, well, he doesn't really have a whole lot of spaces to move to. You got king to d8, which is a forced mate in 3 after queen to f8. Black blocks, knight f7, the king has to go up, and then queen to d6 is a very picturesque mate. And if you try to go to e8, then this allows the rook to swing to e1 check, and this is a theme that we have seen before, where the rook gets out of the line of fire with check, and black is losing at this point. After king to d8, white can simply play knight to e6 check, and black has nothing better, honestly, than to just give up the queen for the knight, because once the king goes here, queen to f8 is checkmate. So after the queen takes the knight, what's of crucial significance here, and this takes a bit of mental calculation to see this far ahead, the back rank is not mating for black, because when white moves the rook back, this queen, which gave check to the black king from before, also protects e1. There's a lot of calculation you have to do as black to realize that there's no way to wriggle out of a horrible loss if you take the rook. So von Bardeleben plays king to f8. At this point, magic ensues, because white can't actually snag this queen. Whether white takes the queen with the rook or the queen, black plays rook to c1, and that's mating. However, what white finds here is nothing short of incredible when he plays rook to f7 check, offering the rook again. Now sure, the king can't take it this time, and if the queen takes it, well, we have the same deal as before, where white basically picks up both of black's rooks, and then is able to force an exchange of queens, leading to a totally won game. Although this is actually even worse. Well, no, it's not any worse. It's about the same. Yeah, it's about the same thing. Where it's a king and pawn endgame, only white has a knight. It's like bringing a gun to a knife show. So, I don't know actually what's wrong with bringing a gun to a knife show. I guess no one gives a shit about your gun. Anyway, then black plays king to g8. Now, you can't go the other way here. If you try to go to e8, then you just get checkmated on d7, so congratulations, it's over. So, king to g8 it is, and you can see where this is going. White then slides the rook another square over and gives check on g7. So, now the king cannot take the rook very simply, because when white picks up the queen, it is with check. And then, of course, white also gets both of black's rooks, so that's unacceptable. And then if white takes the rook with the queen, then this theme repeats of trading off the rooks on c8, and then also exchanging queens, leading to the winning endgame, where white is up a knight and black has no pieces left. So if the black king goes here, it does not work after knight takes h7 check. Now either the king has to go here and get mated on d7, or the king has to take the rook, and then the queen is captured with check, and white is winning. So again, the king cannot go back from whence it came. It must go into the corner, and here white plays rook takes h7 with check. So the rook landed here with an amazing sacrifice and slid one square over every single move until finally the black king got cornered. Once again, the queen cannot take the rook. If you take the rook with the queen, then white ends up winning both your rooks, trading queens, and having a one endgame where he's up a knight. So black goes to g8. And after king to g... Oh, sorry, hang on a second. I'm actually getting my total game wrong here. Let me actually follow the moves of the game. After king to h8 and rook takes h7, black did take the rook on h7. And then after rook takes c8, black lost for the reasons I just mentioned. Well, what would happen if the king went to g8? If you move to g8, then actually the rook can go to g7 check. And for all the same reasons that we talked about before, the black king can't go to f8. But if the black king goes to the corner, as he did a move ago, the fact that this pawn is missing now changes everything. Because now it's actually a forced mate in 9. White plays queen to h4 check. And then what follows is a very beautiful zigzag of forced moves. The white queen inches ever closer to the black king, ever closer, one move at a time, until finally we get to this situation. And now if the king goes to d8, then we have queen check, queen blocks, knight checks, and then this checkmate that we saw in an earlier hypothetical variation. And if from this point the king goes to d6, then white actually has queen captures on f6, and this rook on c1 is blocking the king's retreat, so the black queen has to give itself up, and then white plays queen takes e6 checkmate. It's a real shame that Kurt von Bardeleben did not allow any of this to happen, and instead, after rook takes h7, he essentially threw in the towel with queen takes h7, and on the following move, he resigned. Well, thanks for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Please like and or subscribe if you did, and I'll see you again soon with some more videos, chess and otherwise. Take care, everybody.